Good morning. Please turn with me to Hebrews, the third chapter. Hebrews, the third chapter, and we will begin reading, God willing, let's start at verse 16. We'll take a short passage, and I'm going to try to expand it out and give it some context as we look at the subject today, the lens. The lens. Why the lens? Well, lenses are very important to me because I can't see much without them. And so as I began to study this passage today, it goes back to a part of Israel's history that I'd studied so much that I just really neglected to go back and look at it. And this passage didn't start to make sense to me until I actually opened up the Word, went back to Numbers 14, which is where this really is rooted in. It's the story of Israel and how they slipped. And that is why it was so important for me, is because when I looked at the lens, I said, I can look at this passage through the lens of Hebrews 3 being the only thing that he's really talking about in these first 6 chapters. Or I can expand it out and see what Brother Don and Brother Brian really read from last week. And that is the example that Christ has set in spite of the period of time in Israel's history that this draws back on. And it's not a really great period of Israel's history. Why is that? Because it's the period in which they sent out the spies to spy out the land, and having come back to give the report, how many of them gave actually a good report? It was 2. right? It reminded me of those times in life we're here. We've talked about it before in weeks past, how I loved getting a chance to go to the basketball game and see a team that they didn't make the tournament, but 5-5, they're still happy on the bench. And we talked about how in weeks past, even beyond that, there are times when people are looking for a team in which they can actually win a championship. That's the time of year we're in now. But there are times in life where you are going to be stuck in a situation where you have to learn how to survive on a team that is not destined to win, right? And so that is what happened in this period of Israel's history. If you look at it through the lens of just focusing on this period of rebuke and punishment, all you'll see is God condemning a people to walk for 40 years in the wilderness. But if you expand your vision out, you'll see that in that period of time, heroes came to rise. Why? Because even though they walked for 40 years in the wilderness, what happened to Caleb? I think Caleb was given the opportunity to survive through that period. And who was the next leader to rise out of that generation? Was it somebody who was going to be born? No, it was somebody who was already there. It was Joshua. And so even though Moses was destined to fall in that period of time as well, who do you remember standing with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, which is actually in the Promised Land? Elijah and Moses standing with Jesus. And so the lens through which we look at these stories has a lot to do with what we see. Because no matter what the apparent condition of the team, he's saying that you have to learn to walk with God no matter what the circumstance. And how does that apply? That applies to family. We've heard our brother ask for prayers many weeks for a family situation that does not look like there's a lot of hope in it. So how do you learn to walk productively in a situation where even in your family it doesn't look like it's coming out of the spiral? How do you learn to walk in a situation where no matter what's going on in the country, your situation may seem like you are stuck in a situation where you're having to walk in a spiral? Why? Because none of us are an island unto ourselves. We are plugged into something. And ideally, we're plugged into healthy things. But what this story is telling us is that you can still have hope when you're plugged into things that don't seem like they're moving forward in the direction you want them to move. And how do you do that, Caleb? How do you do that, Joshua? And how do you do that? Oh, wait a minute. I think I remember the story of a woman named Rahab when they finally came out of it, right? And so we're looking at people who learned how to save themselves and their families in otherwise circular patterns of life where it didn't seem like there was a whole lot of hope. And that's what's going on here. As we begin in chapter 3 at verse 16, where we mentioned, it says, "For who were those who heard and rebelled? Was it not all those who left Egypt led by Moses? And with him who was he? With whom was he provoked for 40 years? Was it not those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but those who were disobedient? So we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief. Wait a minute. What does unbelief have to do with disobedience, Paul? Okay, it may not be Paul, right? But whoever wrote this, what does it have to do with this? Again, I don't necessarily think I know now, but I do know going back to Numbers 14, and hopefully you'll do that in your own time of personal study, because of course, to try to keep this in the proper bounds of time, I'm not going back there today, but there are a few things I want you to notice if you do go back to Numbers 14 to look at this study. And it's the fact that they looked at that particular part of their life through the lens of unbelief. And looking at life through that lens led them into the disobedience, the sin, and the rebellion. See, why is that? Because there's one, okay, let's just go back there. Numbers 14, one verse I want you to look at in particular, as I ask you to pray for me to avoid the temptation to try to preach the entire passage. So pray as you turn. Pray as you turn. Pray as you turn to Numbers 14. And back up actually to 13. In verse 30. In the middle of the story where it talks about the report of the spies, it says, verse 30, but Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are able to overcome it. Then the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go against the people, for they are stronger than we. They are exactly right. But here's the problem with the wrong lens. They were looking at it under the microscope. And what that helped me to understand is that there are times when I'm looking at my problems under a microscope. And a microscope is an effective, a powerful tool for looking closely at certain things. It's great for having me get a clearer view of my problems. But as we talked about in the past, the more I look at the microscope, the less I'm able to see the circumstances around me. And it's not that they were wrong about the size and the strength of the people in the land. What they were doing is they were neglecting to see the possibilities of overcoming. And that was the distinction between a Joshua and a Caleb and the people who only fixated not on what was wrong. How much help would it have been for Caleb to try to tell them, no, you're wrong, the people are small, when they really were big? It says they were the children of the Anak. Maybe they were exaggerating. Maybe they were right, though. But here's the problem. Their unbelief came from the fact that they didn't think about the fact that no matter how big the people were they bigger in terms of the size of the army than the army of Pharaoh, who they'd already seen drowned in the Red Sea? Were they bigger than the 10 plagues that had already caused the Egyptians to free them from bondage? Not only freeing them, sending them out rich. Was it bigger than the cloud that separated between Pharaoh's army chasing them and them pinned against the Red Sea as they were seeking to leave Egypt? No, this new challenge wasn't bigger than anything, but as they were looking at their problems under the microscope, they were forgetting the things through which God had already delivered them. And I thought about it like I always said, like I always say, I can look at them as people who are to be shamed, or I can look at them for the times I take on that same lens. And that's why the lens was so important. Why? Because there are times in my life where, unlike what I feel confident that we were able to do this morning, let's just brainstorm. Going forward, what can we do? A lot of that is the product of me looking at this passage and realizing, Marcus, I can look at this through the lens of what's going wrong. Or I can ask people, what can we do? And find things that I didn't even thought about. Oh, wait a minute. Context. What has gone well in the past? Here. What have you seen work in other places? What do you think might help going forward? Those are all things that I miss the more I look at life through the lens of the microscope. And is the microscope faulty? No. The microscope is on time and on point if I need to see things small, right? So it's not that we throw out the microscope. It's, Marcus, you have to tap into the one who can see both as God with one lens, the microscopic and the global all at one time. And that is what we see as we go back to Hebrews chapter 3. See, what's happening is this story is not the way that he opens up the book of Hebrews. He opens up the book of Hebrews talking about Jesus. And sometimes I can, as a kid growing up in the church, I can see talks on parts of the word to talk about Jesus, and I can start to check out. Matter of fact, I'll tell you, the first time I talked about when I started in preaching school, I didn't go straight to sunset. I wanted to see, okay, am I making a knee-jerk reaction to this period in my life? Or do I really have a genuine interest in studying the word? So I went to night school first, right? Finished the whole term in night school. And the classes I was least interested in were the classes that were about Jesus. Why, preacher, are you least interested in the classes about Jesus? And if that's the case, are you focusing on the right things? No, I actually wasn't. And that was one of the beauties of preaching school. I wanted Jesus to do everything else but teach me about who he was, right? I had all these other ideas about how Jesus could be productive for all the different issues I had sorted out in my head. There would be a good reason to start a ministry. And I started to realize that all of those things that I thought were good ideas meant nothing unless I began to learn about who he was. Thus, the Hebrew writer starts off saying things that can be easy for us to check out on as many of us lifelong Christians, but are essential to us understanding the difference between my vision and godly vision, which sees, like, I need these glasses to see out the back of the church, but there are an inhibitor if I'm trying to read this Bible. Jesus, once again, is the one who sees with that kind of balance. And so understanding him is part of what begins to give me a heart lens and a mind's eye that is able to see with balance the things that he's trying to show me. Back up, please, to chapter 2 to understand. We talked on Wednesday. John and I talked about, okay, well, if you had to sum up Hebrews with one verse, how would you sum it up? And I told him, of course, I got a bias. My bias is in chapter 2 when he says, verse 1, therefore we must pay closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. For since the message declared by angels proved to be reliable, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? And that's what he's talking about when he goes through this litany of descriptions of who Jesus is. He's like, understand, later on he's going to say around chapter 10, if you were rejecting the word of Moses under the old law, you would die on the witness of 2 or 3 witnesses. Moses had never seen heaven. We've talked about it before. Jesus is the one who is witnessing from heaven. And so Moses' word, having never seen heaven, simply witnessing from earth, brought a just retribution. He's saying, how much more the things that we see witnessed from heaven? But is it simply Jesus offering up a condemnation? No. Why? Because I got a chance to look at Pilgrim's Progress over the last week. I say look at because it wasn't originally written as a movie. It was written before there were movies, right? But I start seeing these clips that are animated clips, and they talk to me because I don't like to read so much all the time, in case it didn't become obvious. Anyway, I saw this one about Legality Hill, and I wanted to steer away from that one because that seems like a doctrinal dispute to me, right? But I started watching as this pilgrim Christian carries this heavy burden, his backpack, and he's trying to climb this hill that's insurmountable because every time he takes a step, a new rule pops up from behind the last rule that he just got through tripping over. And every time he's taking a step, he's trembling in fear as he tries to abide by all the regulations. And what this began to say to me was in this particular passage in Hebrews, I heard people describe John Bunyan as one who basically had the Bible coming out of his pores. And it wasn't until I turned back to see the story of the Exodus in the story of Numbers that I began to realize, wait a minute, it almost seemed like it was a literal allegory, not just for the walk of an individual Christian, but every other thing I was reading from the Exodus seemed to be something that correlated to an image that Bunyan was making. And this is what I saw in Legality Hill. In Legality Hill, I saw my own burden, right? Because it's not just the burden of my sin that I have to let go of, the residual of trying to overcome the things that I've done. It is that added social pressure that comes from trying to not only meet the standards of what I think God is asking me to do, but the added burden of things that I've simply taken on over the years of simply going through the motions without truly understanding who Jesus is and what he's looking for. See, here's the irony. My lens always taught me that going toward Jesus meant more rules, but I didn't realize the ways in which it actually meant more freedom. See, because there are times I can go out into a certain social institution, right? I told you before about the whole period of life. We have a sister now who's looking at going into college and making decisions about what's ahead. My guidance counselor has a whole bunch of burdens that Jesus doesn't have for me. That's in high school and college, right? And so as I'm trying to decide what I want to do with my life, if I'm not careful, onto that backpack that I'm trying to take up Legality Hill is a whole bunch of social expectations for people who don't ever read the word that Jesus never put in my backpack. And the things that are being added on that hill are all kinds of things that as I begin to accumulate friends, it's cool to have friends, but if my friends aren't focused on the things that Jesus really cares about, I can start to take on social pressures that Jesus never intended for me to have as I'm trying to climb that hill. And the less I focus, or really the more I focus on the fact that we talked about it before, these, when we're looking at, as they talk about the distinction in chapter 3 of Hebrews, of the rebellion, the sin, and the disobedience, sin, once again, we've said, it's that time when you're aiming to do the right thing. Sin does not start out as an unhealthy desire. It starts out as a healthy desire to do the right thing. Friends are necessary in this life. We talked about, as we're talking about ways to move forward, we got to be friends, right? And more than that, we got to be family. And so that is a healthy desire. But the more my microscope is fixed on friendship with those who, yes, could potentially be great friends, but none of us are going to be we're neither going to have great friends or we're neither going to be great friends until we have a firm understanding of what exactly it is that Jesus is asking from us. Right? Why? Because the more I fall in love with the 5-year plan, or the friends who are like-minded along the path of that 5-year plan, the more and more I'm going to grow an emotional attachment to those things that really are weighing me down as I try to walk an already difficult road. And here's the thing. What Jesus is saying is, when he says, what? My burden is way more difficult than you could ever know. My burden is easy and my yoke is light. That never made sense to me, because I was always trying to live in those two worlds. And you're going to be exhausted trying to live in those two worlds. And what was my natural response, like the children of Israel? Blame Jesus. Why? Because I'm trying to serve you. But the lie was I was trying to serve him only. And thus the pure heart is so important. Over and over again, we talk about having a pure heart. See, the burdens I was taking on was the burden of trying to be popular in the world and be a good Christian. And that's part of why Legality Hill seemed so treacherous. It's because I was telling myself I was serving Jesus, but in reality, right, I was trying to do something else. And so until I could, one of the reasons why confession is so important, until I could pull my eyes away from the microscope and start to realize that I had taken on burdens that were completely inconsistent with his calling, I could not fully appreciate the peace of walking the narrow path as I tried to ascend Legality Hill. And so understand, as we back up to chapter 2, one of the benefits of understanding what Jesus is trying to do is understanding not so much how he's trying to draw us into our experience. The whole story starts with him condescending to ours. Verse 10 of chapter 2, for it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. That is why he is not ashamed to call them brothers, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers in the midst of the congregation, and I will sing your praise. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I am the children God has given me. Verse 14, as Brother Don read this morning, since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. For surely it is not angels that he helps, but he helps the offspring of Abraham. We got to pause there. I, for years, just read past that as he helps the offspring and just blah, 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 blah. Right? Because it's talking about Jesus. Like I told you before, I would glaze over as we heard about Jesus. But why does he say the offspring of Abraham? Why didn't he say the offspring of Adam? It's because just like any other time we've talked about, we got finite amounts of energy. We got finite resources. And even though you're absolutely right, I remember one time there was a young man on the football team out at the Eastern New Mexico University. He had a horrible temper. Nice guy, but he had a horrible temper. And he would blow up about once a month. And one time old man got tired and confronted him. I was like, look, I don't remember what I said to the young man. But his response was, Jesus loves everybody. I was like, really? Jesus loves Hitler, buddy? And then the conversation just kind of flatlined as he kind of at least paused for a minute. I was like, yeah, Jesus might love Hitler, but I'm guaranteeing you he's helping the sons of Abraham, right? And when he's talking about the sons of Abraham, he's talking about in any situation, as much as I love you, I only got so much energy to spend. And the people who I'm trying to help are the people who are trying to, one, help themselves, and God willing, help others. And that's what this story is about. When he's saying help the children of Abraham, ask yourself, why did the author choose the children of Abraham and not the children of Adam? Children of Adam are everybody. The children of Abraham, by extension, are us. Those of us who decide they are going to abide in the teachings and the ways of him. Why? Because he said he could have hit an easy button, as in the Staples or whatever the story is. He could have saved us from heaven by remote control. You think just like I could turn on my TV, he can't turn in salvation, right? Before we even knew, we could pick up let my phone over there. Pick up our phones and talk into it. And if you were wise enough, we went through that whole thing about a year ago. If I know how to connect it to one of those the 3D printers, I can speak into existence. I can speak into existence a gun now, right? If I know how to doctor my computer up and hook it up to the voice commands. But God, in the very beginning, who spoke creation into existence, don't you think he could have spoken salvation into existence? Why do you have to come and suffer? Well, the answer is he didn't have to. He chose to. And when he says he's not ashamed to call them brethren, the people he's not ashamed to call brethren are the people who are willing to do the same thing. Things they could do from a distance, they're willing to go in and hurt to make happen. I know, dead horse, I say it every week now. But that's the reality of what's going on. And if it wasn't happening in each of these letters, I wouldn't get the chance to beat the dead horse, right? It's like love. You want Marcus to stop preaching about love as we go through the Bible? You tell Paul to stop writing about it. And so if you want him to stop talking about how suffering is the lens through which Christ chose to identify with us, and Timothy or Titus, if that is the lens through which you're going to be able to identify with the congregation, he keeps mentioning it for a reason. And even though it's even better if Paul didn't write this one, because now it's coming from a completely different voice, right? And so now you got more than one person saying suffering is the lens through which Christ came to identify us. Why is that? Why? Just so Marcus preaches the same thing every week? No, because if we skip forward to chapter 4, verse 14. Now he's starting to talk about Jesus as the high priest, giving us a little bit more insight into his role as high priest before he really goes into a discussion of that in chapter 7. Chapter 4, verse 14, since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. And that is so much of my struggle. One of the reasons why I don't want to draw near to Jesus is the embarrassment and the shame of it. But one of the most amazing stories that I have seen in a minute, I saw this morning as I was thumbing through YouTube trying to find something to get my mind in the right spot before I got to get up and come talk, right? I saw this picture. I told you about the young man we had as a former student who got mauled. I saw a story this morning about a young lady who was mauled by 2 dogs as she went to go dog sit close to home in Dallas, Texas. Never seen it before. I heard about a mauling story. I thought it was that one. So I click on it, not wanting to click on anything too heavy. I keep seeing it come through my feed, so I just, okay, fine, I'll click on it. And the story was about her, and I didn't know they had footage of the police responding to the scene. And these 2 dogs that she had to deal with on her own kept police officers at bay for 37 minutes. And they showed the body cam footage of the cops trying to get in the door and not being able to get in the door because of the dogs. And these are the dogs that left her basically for dead. And they're talking to her. I can see her foot in the window, right? And so when they finally get in, you see a cop pick her up and set her into a place where the paramedics can deal with her. And then when you see her doing an interview with CBS News, it's amazing, right? And the thing that stood out to me more than anything is they showed her boyfriend, who was with her as she came home. And I'm always, you know me, I'm just suspicious of everything. So I'm looking at the boyfriend's face. I'm like, is he really gonna stay with her? How long is he gonna stay with her? I'm trying to read into his, right? Because it's a tough challenge now, right? But as they sit and they actually talk to this young couple, he's talking about how she drove me to cancer treatments as a young man. They're in their 20s. While I was dealing with cancer. She was there each step of the way. And this is what he said. I appreciate this opportunity to return some of the love that she showed me while I was dealing with cancer. And so when I heard him say that connected to what I saw in this particular passage. Because when you're talking about what Jesus did in empathizing with who we are, please continue in verse 1 of chapter 5. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relationship to God, to offer gift and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset by weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And understand, it's not just Jesus, it's us as his servants. If we are truly going to be equipped to deal with people in the proper way, we are going to have to be able to deal with them through the lens of our own weakness. Why? Because that never keeps us very far removed from what this young man was in touch with during this very difficult time. See, he remembered what it was like to be weak and going through treatments and times when he couldn't care for himself. He needed someone to get him to and from where he needed to go. And the beautiful thing about what happened with this young man is it seems like it's instilled something in his character that now allows him to see beauty with a different lens that looks beyond what he once was able to see on the outside, to fall in love with what was there for him when maybe God could have brought somebody else to him to help him through that time. But that's who God had brought to him, and that's who he was now attached to, and that's who he was now unwilling to leave. And so from that perspective, it's not just Jesus. That's what he's expecting out of everyone who would want to lead and work on his behalf. It's that level of concern that understands the degree to which others struggle with their sin, often as we try to carry a heavy load up legality hill. Verse 4. And no one takes this honor on himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." As he also says in another place, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And of course, if you've gone through Hebrews before, you'll know that Melchizedek had neither beginning nor end, and that is those are the bounds put on Christ's ministry. There's no beginning and no ending to his ministry. And so even though in life we are blessed, like we said before, if you can find one or two friends who will stick through you, even through the most evil of ordeals, you're fortunate. But the good thing about those good friends, those blessed friends that God brings us in this life, is they are only a picture of how much Jesus loves us. It's kind of like when you make a down payment on a house, right? You make it with the agreement that you're going to make that payment in full. That down payment is not the full payment for the house. It's just the honest money. It's the agreement that you're going to fully make good on the full value of that house. Good friends are a down payment on the day that we see Jesus, right? And ultimately, that's the lens through which he wants us to look at life. He wants us not to look at life through the lens of our problems. See, because the problem with what happened in Israel is they looked at their problems not only through the lens of unbelief. When they were faced with Pharaoh to their back and the Red Sea to their front, they were looking at their problems through the lens of their fears. And then when they were thirsty in the wilderness, they were looking at their problems through the lens of their physical deprivation. And again, when they were hungry, the manna, the rebellion against the manna was looking at life through the lens of their hunger. And I've heard, trying not to say it, T.D. Jakes say it this way: try not to make decisions when you're hungry or tired or scared, because that's the wrong lens through which to make important decisions. And here's the thing that they lost track of was the count. See, because as they were looking through the microscope at their problems, they were losing track of the fact that God was growing more and more fatigued with the complaining. And so at the end of what you see in Numbers 14, what happens is he says, these 10 times. And what happened? Moses, I'm sure, didn't even remember what the count was. But God remembered what the count was. And he was basically saying, look, at what point are you going to trust the fact that I can get you through this no matter how great the challenge seems? See, we don't know what Caleb and Joshua said through the first 10 challenges. They might have been right with them through the first 5, right? They might have been right there along, scared, not wondering or not knowing what the day was going to bring. But eventually what happens is, just like you see when we get to Hebrews chapter 11, Samson was a man, was known for his pious life throughout the time of his his time as a judge. No, he's probably known more for his flaws than anything else. But he was able to rally, we've talked about before, in that moment when he was with the Philistines. Gideon, a picture of faith. Oh no, one more thing with the fleece, Lord. One more time. No. See, I need heroes like that because I know what it's like to have faith like that. Faith that doesn't exist really at all. And so while Caleb and Joshua are remembered for the time when they stood tall, one of the things that God often does is he gives us grace to not necessarily put on blast those times that we doubted, but he gives us enough indication of the doubt to show us once again that when we've been pushed to the verge of Legality Hill, we don't have to try to be perfect, because perfection is one of those things that can add to that burden of the pack that's already on my back. See, the word does say, of course, on many junctures, be perfect. But it says be perfect as he is perfect. And that's not perfect in denial. It's not perfect in pretending I have it together. It's perfect in letting him perfect me. And part of that perfection is, once again, we talked about it before, acknowledging, just like that priest who wants to minister as a holy priest before God, this is where I'm weak too, y'all, right? So that ultimately, like that young man who stood by that young woman, do we know if he would have done the same thing before he had been through cancer treatment and chemotherapy? Maybe. But all we know now is after having been through that suffering, he is the kind of spouse everybody would want for their young'uns, right? And so that's the thing. It's through suffering that this young man learned to love that young woman that way. Who knows? They might fall apart tomorrow. But that's not the only story of people who stick by one another in hard times. And so that's a lot of what we're seeing in Hebrews. Yes, there is the story of the failure that Israel went through. Yes, there are times when you are probably going to be caught through no fault of your own. Because if it was just left to Caleb and Joshua by this time, if they had to mature, they would have been just fine. God basically said, Moses, in this story, you go back and read Numbers 14. This is the place where he says, you want an easy button? I'll hit a easy button. I'll start over with you, Moses. Right? And Moses said no, because he was willing to walk that circular path. And what happened was Moses, Caleb, and everybody else who ended up finding peace and grace to get into the promised land, they learned how to walk even in the worst of situations in a way that would please God. So understand, that young man reminded me, as I mentioned him hopefully for the last time now, of someone who did not jump ship, but he learned to walk effectively in what seemed to be a very unfair circumstance. And so my prayer for you is my prayer for me, that we learn to make the most out of every circumstance God brings our way, so that someone can say about us, if nothing else, that person is a picture of endurance, that basically like the peace that surpasses understanding, that has to come from God. And so my prayer for you is my prayer for me, that we can show God's goodness through the way that we are faithful through difficult times.